here with David Mack-Hardiman, who is the director of the History of Disability Museum.
I oversee the museum, yes.
And has written some of the books that
Correct.
are available in the bookstore, the gift shop. David, this is a remarkable place.
Thank you.
And you tell no lies when you say, we think it's one of a kind.
It is one of a kind. It's the only museum of its kind that we're aware of in the world, dedicated exclusively to preserving the history of people with disabilities. We're trying to promote independence, acceptance, tolerance by exhibiting various artifacts and displays about people who have disabilities.
But it's multifaceted. It's not just artifacts.
Right.
It's pop culture, and it's crime and disability, or the criminal understanding, and it's mental illness,
Right.
and it's pop culture and sports, and it's as I already said, multifaceted,
Right.
which is wonderful. Even I hope you don't mind if we stand in your shadow in an ever so humble kind of way. This is only 20 years old,
Right.
and began in someone's garage.
It began in a very small fashion. Our former CEO, Dr. Jim Bowles, was online looking for information about the history of people with disabilities, and he could barely find a thing, so he decided to start collecting things to form a museum. Again, it's the only one of its kind that we're aware of that's exclusive to that. Much of the history is unknown because people who have disabilities or mental illness were often sent away, and the history of people with disabilities is institutional in that regard. So people were sent to large facilities which were often in rural areas so that it was
Isolated.
They were isolated from the general public, and a lot of people didn't really know what went on in these kind of mysterious facilities.
Sometimes we didn't want to know.
Sometimes we didn't want to know, and we believe in telling those stories exactly the way they occurred so that people can learn from that experience and that hopefully have a better understanding of what happened to people with disabilities throughout history.
This is a place, for me, this is a place for hope. And it advocates, I know you advocate, even though it's a history museum, you advocate greater awareness and hope that people will be more included.
Yes, we do.
And therein lies the hope for me. Because I have seen myself and our organization, NeuroSparks, literally advocates greater social connection.
Yes, and we have a lot of events here at the museum. We have speakers who come in to talk about anything from Tourette's syndrome and the inclusion of children who have Tourette's syndrome to people who are visually impaired, people who are deaf, people who...
Yeah, I'm looking at the
American Sign Language.
American Sign Language on the carpet behind us.
Yes, and we recently affiliated with Deaf Access Services here in Buffalo, so we are going to be spending a lot more time signing and having people sign so that they feel included in what we're doing at the same time. So it's really a unique place. We do have publications. Again, we have speakers. We have Galen Lee was here. She came and visited our museum, and I had a wonderful afternoon with her and her husband. So we've had guests from different countries. We've had delegations from Mongolia and Uzbekistan and all sorts of European countries as well too, delegations from Brazil and all over the world. So we're trying to elevate this concept and keep it going for a national discussion about the history of people with disabilities and how we can better educate the American public on that, perhaps through a national museum. So.
And there's a little inspiration in that for us as what people with disabilities teach us. Our first recording was in my basement. So.
Oh, there you go.
And
right.
Yeah, there's hope.
There you go. There you go. Right.
But that is very heartwarming to know that in such a short amount of time we could look around and this isn't a large area,
No, it's not, right?
but it's compact and it's intense.
Right, it is intense. It does take a while to read everything, it takes a while to look at everything, and it takes a while to process what happened. I recall myself going to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and when we left, we really couldn't speak to each other. I mean, it was so powerful, and I know some people have mentioned similarities when they learn about the lives of people and then, you know, understand that they couldn't get out, that some people were placed in institutions and just asked repeatedly to leave or tried to leave, and there was a lot of punishment that occurred when people tried to speak up for themselves, advocate, or leave. Mr. Mocha in the corner over there asked repeatedly to leave and to be paid for his work, and he never got that opportunity. So we want people to understand the isolation and the desperation so that history never repeats itself.
And in a part that we've already recorded, stated that we were going to, if it doesn't sound too hokey, borrow from the old Star Trek series and move along at warp speed.
Right, right.
We're still in warp 1,
Right.
but how apropos, because as the commander would sometimes say warp 10 or warp 9, and the spaceship would take off and Gene Roddenberry left you staring at space dust.
Right.
This whole experience, like you just described, could be breathtaking.
Yes.
For the people that have lived it, sometimes disorienting.
Mm-hmm.
They had lives. That comes out in Suitcases They Left Behind.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that how the mental health community, if I can call them that for a moment, didn't even bother sometimes asking about their former lives.
Well, yes, I mean, at the time, if you were sent to one of those institutions, you know, the desire was for you to become acclimated to the institution. So a lot of times, families were not necessarily involved or, you know, chose not to be involved because of the stigma of mental illness. But there was a lot of disconnect from the general populace when you were sent to an institution. In fact, families were discouraged from visiting for a while so the person could adjust. And it's important to put all of that in context because some people might come here and say, well, where was his family? You know, in his case, it isn't known that he even had relatives in this country until long after he was deceased. You'll see the similarities with many immigrants who were sent to institutions who were here alone, probably didn't speak English well and might have been misinterpreting
Language
what they were doing.
was you know, English was a second language,
Right.
finances were not great,
Right.
so legal access and those kind
Right,
of things.
right,
That's the
yes.
impression I had,
Yes.
that you were very vulnerable.
Very vulnerable. We had an author recently who had written a book regarding the institutionalization of Irish women, and some were taken right off the boat, literally, when they came to this country, if they were not married, because they were viewed as not viable economically. Some were sent to Willard, that's the story of her book, and they were sent there immediately. So there was really no opportunity to prove your worth if you were sent immediately to an institution. So that was the story of those folks. But you know, you'll see similarities. Again, some people were new immigrants, some people were alone. They didn't have a lot of social support. This gentleman's wife and child died, and you know, he was left alone and then started exhibiting some symptoms of mental illness. But you know, what you see is that people were sent for long periods of time, perhaps could have easily come
30,
out.
40, 50 years,
Yes,
the rest of their
yes.
lives, and
Right.
sometimes they weren't at all violent or threatening.
Right, that's right.
I mean, this man that you're referring to, I believe it, is this Mr. Graham? Or no, this is Mr. Dimitra.
He painted.
Among
right.
other things,
Yes.
wanted to propose
Yes.
to
To the daughter of the President Truman,
Yeah.
because he had made an artistic display for the president. And luckily, he was taken to a hospital. I mean, you have to understand that he was proposing to marry the daughter of the president, and other times he might have been.
But he wasn't saying or else.
Right. He might have been taken in by the Secret Service, or something else might have happened. So he was fortunate in that regard, and he did get to paint and do things that he wanted to do, despite being institutionalized. And I don't want to negate that there wasn't therapy in the institution, because there was. There was occupational therapy, the belief that if people are busy and doing things, they might feel better. Physical therapy for those who might have needed it as well too, and obviously there were hospitals for people who became ill, etc. So, institutions were beyond the concept of an almshouse, which we've also preserved some of those histories.
Or jail.
Yes, and there were more things for people to do that were therapeutic. There were recreational activities, bowling.
Yeah, even stage.
Yes, and people might have performed, or they had a marching band, as you saw over there. So,
but they also were expected to work without compensation.
Exactly, right. So, that's what we're trying to do, put it all into context, and then people can be the judge of what they think was good or bad. We're not trying to put those ideas in people's heads. It's just, but the stories themselves are so secretive in some regards because of the location of the institutions. Even though thousands of people live there, there's very little written or recorded about them.
And Willard, you correct me if I'm incorrect about this, was in many ways an illustration or an institution would be typical of those across the country, because isolated in rural area, large, castle-like sometimes.
It's huge.
Yeah,
it's huge. Yes.
And there were just so many things about it that similar places all across America.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's true. It's one. These are a few patients of thousands who live there. In their cemetery alone, there's almost 7,000 people buried there.
And we're going to talk about that later,
Yeah.
that there's a certain passion here
Yes.
for restoration of cemeteries.
Yes, we have done a lot of work in regard to that, trying to preserve the history of the locations. Again, many are functionally abandoned at this point. Many institutions become prisons, and then the prison system inherits the cemetery and all the property that goes with it. I've been very fortunate to have worked with several in the area who have been very cooperative in allowing us to help and providing us with supplies and things to make the cemeteries look better. We believe in equity, and it just doesn't seem right when some people are buried with a number or nothing at all. No recognition of their life or death, and we've been fortunate that everyone's been extremely cooperative, including the New York State Department of Corrections, and they've helped us a great deal.
David, we don't want to dominate your time. You've already been generous, and maybe we can have you back after you've run some of your errands.
Yes, I have a few errands.
But thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Mike.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're back, and I wanted to pick up where David left off in talking about Mr. Mocha. He's the first person featured in the Suitcases They Left Behind. He was the person that took care of the cemetery eventually, but he didn't start out in life that way as the person who took care of Willard State Hospital Cemetery. He began with birth, and like so many of the patients of Willard, immigrated from Galicia in Austria. In 1878, he was born to abject poverty, one of 4 children. His father died when he was very young, leaving his mother to raise 4 children. And he managed and plodded along in life for a while till he was institutionalized for the first time back in Germany. He got a little tipsy, as folks sometimes are wont to do, whistled and sang and made a lot of noise. And as we were trying to describe, David and I, sometimes it didn't take much for a person to be institutionalized, especially a poor person. So in 1900, for the first time, only for less than a year, he was admitted to a hospital asylum kind of facility back in Germany. And then when he was released, he joined the Kaiser's army for a little while, but immigrated in 1907 to the United States at the age of 29, where he worked in Manhattan for the next 9 or 10 years as a window washer. Very humble life, lived in an all-male dormitory at Bellevue Hospital, ironically, where one evening he again, I presume he was a little inebriated, because after the incident they took him across the street to the alcoholic department for Bellevue Hospital. Again, he was whistling and singing very loud and boisterous, making a lot of noise. I'm not by any means suggesting or describing a flawless character, but a lot of that kind of behavior, half the people I went to high school with would be indicted if those kinds of things were a crime at some point in their life. It hardly merited what took place next. After he spent some time at Bellevue, then he was eventually transferred to Willard State Hospital. It was said that he heard voices. One study shows that upwards of maybe 5% of people in the general population say they hear voices. That was not necessarily a sign of insanity or madness. So they sent him anyway. They often did, rather than some other kind of place and not knowing what to do with him. So many people, by the thousands, wound up in state hospitals during that time. In 1916, he arrived at Willard State Hospital, and he was a pretty good patient. I mean, helped around the dorm, and eventually with gardening and kinds of things, made his way to the cemetery, was such a model patient that after not much time, they gave him the run of the place. He took care of the cemetery better than it was taken care of after he died. Not only digging graves immaculately, one person said he dug graves in rectangular boxes to perfection. And he did that from 1937 until his death in 1968. He sometimes, in warmer weather, he'd build a little shack in the cemetery and would just stay out there and play the harmonica, mostly for himself, not to entertain anyone else. Very peaceful man, didn't even take his meals with other patients, but would go back in the kitchen and they'd fix him a plate, and he would just come and go as he pleased until the day he died. He wasn't even on any medications. One could very much question whether he belonged all of his life in a state hospital for the mentally ill. But someone like him was very vulnerable, as David and I were talking about, and that's where he landed. There were 5,776 graves at Willard Hospital. During one 14-year stretch, Mr. Mocha dug 1,400 of those graves, and many more in the other years that he was caretaker of the cemetery. Many of his artifacts are still here. His suitcase is on display. We now know that he has family not only back in Europe, but here. David was sharing with me that he has family in Iowa with whom the museum has contact. So indeed, one of many interesting stories here at the History of Disability Museum, starting with Mr. Lawrence, he's sometimes called, or Mr. Mocha. let's resume. Mr. Rodrigo was a very small boy when all of the turmoil and upheaval was going between the Spanish-American War, in which the United States received Philippines from Spain after the war, and then there was some rebellion on the part of the Filipinos, and in particular the governor, who resisted American takeover, and ultimately the Americans forced the governor to surrender and agree that the Philippines would be governed by the United States. It was during that time that Mr. Rodrigo's family, some of them were seemingly supportive of the U.S. takeover. And the U.S. was interested in cultivating friends, especially among the elite, which Mr. Rodrigo's family would have been wealthy enough to send children to the United States, become educated, and then return to the Philippines so that they would have a favorable impression of American way of life. All of that is background for Mr. Rodrigo, who arrived and began his education in Salt Lake City, where he quickly proved himself a much above average student in the 6th grade and in the 7th grade. Completed 7th grade one summer immediately following his 6th grade. Went on to 8th grade graduation. This is the picture of his 8th grade class down here, I think, which he described as one of the happiest days in his life. And on until I do believe his high school graduation was in 1916. And he was a Protestant. He was so proud when he graduated from 8th grade and received his certificate that he couldn't wait to show it to his minister. And the writers of the Suitcases Left Behind makes the point, what an interesting turn of events that this young man wanted to proudly display his achievements to his minister, his Methodist minister, but not necessarily to his parents back in the Philippines, who he hardly ever mentions in his letters. Other relatives, yes. Parents, no. So, not at all sure of what was going on there. He continued to be an advocate throughout his life for Philippine independence, although he was not at all violent about it or anything. He was often described as a model patient once he arrived at Willard, which would just be in another couple of years. Fell in love, was introduced by a family now in Chicago, where he moved and finished high school. Fell into a group of Philippine young men and became friends and liked his life there, but also married a lady by the name of Smith, and her mother was very much against the relationship that he struck up with her daughter, and it is just surmised he went into the Navy and did well in the area of the Great Lakes and around Mackinac Island, Michigan. But next thing we knew, in 1918, he seems to show up in Buffalo, New York. It's been speculated that perhaps Mrs. Smith sent her daughter to Buffalo and he followed her there. Things appear not to have gone well, and among other things, there's mention that he had perhaps contracted syphilis, and maybe in getting together with the love of his life and discussing matters, it had been traumatic. But the next thing you know, he is living as a domestic servant with a lady in Buffalo, and she turns him in after a couple of months because he is frequently complaining about being depressed and experiencing physical pain as well as hearing voices. And she's had enough and goes to the authorities, and he appears before the judge, who has him committed to Willard State Hospital in 1918, where he lives out his life. Again, never causes any problems. Mr. Rodrigo doesn't. He experienced some difficult vision later in life, glaucoma and blindness, as well as cataracts. So, that's pretty much what takes place. Again, another immigrant story. He loved to read as long as he could, and then he listened to audiobooks in the late 1970s, experienced some colon cancer, which eventually, even though part of that was taken care of with surgery, it went on to spread, and he died at the age of 83 in the early 80s. Another sad story is that of Teresa Lehner, better known as Sister Marie Ursuline, which she became. She was born in 1870 in Saxony to a father who was a widower, not many relatives, some sprinkling of cousins in nearby villages or in the area, but by the time 1896 came around, she was recruited from her Bavarian town by Mother Antonia Fisher in Great Bend, Kansas, to immigrate to the United States and take up the life of a nun in that part of America. She took her vows in 1898 in Brooklyn and became Sister Marie Ursuline, and was quite happy and content living out the life to which she'd been called. Her life had some purpose to it. She was nearly 30 years of age at that point in time, but unexpectedly and in a way that she never really recovered from, there was some reason that the Bishop of Chicago removed Mother Antonia, who was very much a parental figure for Sister Marie Ursuline. Mother Antonia was someone that she looked up to, the other nuns looked up to, and when Mother Antonia was removed as the head of the order, as the prioress, then they were at a loss as to what becomes of us and what do we do. A local father came in and presented in a brief talk what their options were. They could accept the new prioress, which Sister Marie Ursuline chose not to do. He said, well, then you can leave. And without giving her dispensation or any other option, she did leave, even though she felt that she would find a place as a nun in some other place. She never did. She went back and forth. First, she went with Mother Antonia and maybe 3 of the other sisters, searching for a convent that would accept them. They spent some time in North Dakota, where she taught. That could be wrong. I think they went as far as California and back and forth across America, looking for a home to live out their religious calling. Finally, in Brooklyn, Sister Marie Ursuline was on her own, and she was gaining weight and beginning to demonstrate some bizarre behavior, but just the same, she articulated to a local judge her case, and also reported to the church another appeal for dispensation, back and forth. If you aren't going to accept me as a nun, then release me from my vows. She was left in limbo. and there wasn't a direction for her, and someone had her appear before the local judge who had her committed. Again, another person that was purported to hear voices began to exhibit some regression because, well, it's almost understandable if everything had been stripped away from her in terms of meaning and purpose in life, then you start to act like who you were before you had those areas of responsibility. And the more she was treated over time like someone who didn't belong anywhere, the more she became more childlike and was rumored or reported to have displayed silly behavior, even some running around in the nude. Hardly an image that we would retain of someone who very much wanted to be a nun. But she was transferred to Willard State Hospital in, well, I'm trying to remember the year, June of she went to Manhattan State Hospital in June of 1918, and later on was sent to Willard. Always tried to be helpful on the ward, always searching for some purpose and some usefulness to wherever she was, and just never seemed to find it. Didn't have many possessions with her. Her health declined physically as well as mentally, and she died at the age of 69, and her body was used for scientific purposes. She legally and technically could have been buried with full habit as a nun, but she was even denied that since the dispensation was never administered. So she was a sad case of someone who just got swept up, and she had never committed any terrible crime or demonstrated any kind of dangerous behavior, any of those kinds of things that we think of for a person who is mentally ill, and yet she wound up living out her life at Willard State Hospital. The location where, after Willard State Hospital had closed, and people were canvassing the facility before tearing down this massive place, was in a work area in which they went up to the attic and discovered over 400 suitcases in this place that was just a haven for pigeons and pigeon droppings all over everything. And accidentally they found this treasure trove of artifacts of people's belongings that were stored just as they had arrived on the day of their arrival to this institution. And oftentimes everything that made a connection with their previous lives were in those suitcases, which were a variety. Sometimes they were doctor's bags. One person had 18 suitcases of different sizes. Sometimes they were sparse, like Mr. Mocha's had a couple shaving mugs and a shaving brush and a couple of other things. Sometimes, like Sister Ursuline's suitcase, they had lots of written devotionals, handwritten, and Bible, and different kinds of religious artifacts and memorabilia. Sometimes, like the lady we're going to see in just a moment, there was beautiful and ornate kinds of embroidery and sewing. And a couple of ladies we're going to talk about last, they had very beautiful clothing because they had backgrounds in which they were educated and traveled and were in their day quite attractive as young women. So real diversity of contents, and so they knew that they couldn't in any way present that many suitcases, and it was narrowed down to 29, and 10 were chosen for this book, of which we're talking about today. So, one person's, this African-American man, everything, including his military uniform, was just meticulous. He lived a simple lifestyle, and yet everything was just so about his life. Very orderly, very carefully maintained, and that's some of what we're talking about. Most folks who deal or interact with disabilities in any kind of way will tell you there's two approaches to disabilities, two world understandings regarding disability. Neither are wrong, they're just two perspectives. One is the medical perspective and the other is the social perspective. We see that both could be cruel, and sometimes they're combined. Here, these pictures from the Middle Ages demonstrate how there weren't many adaptive devices for people who were amputees or who were lame and lacking in mobility. The caption goes on to say, sometimes to make more effective beggars, they were even further impaired, if you can imagine such cruelty. And maybe another limb was moved away, or as we often have heard about Chinese women having their feet bound and things like that, in order to rake in more money as beggars, their caretakers would in some way make them more pitiful. An example of medical, I'm saying because it's physical, but also a social aspect. This is who you are and this is how you belong to in the world. Or later on, they were court gestures and they were depicted as fools because they were entertaining. And that illustrated how somebody could be treated humanely through some kind of employment, but still regarded socially as less than human. Here you see captivity, kept in cages and corrals. This took place even in western Pennsylvania. One illustration is given in one of the books they sell here at the museum of a place where people were kept in corrals. So even though this is a much older picture, oftentimes people were segregated by physical means through cages, prisons, and so forth and so on. Early on, and I'll challenge this in present times, the church or religious communities, I don't want to exclude Judaism or Islam or any of those religions, there was a relationship aspect with people who were disabled. They weren't just cared for in custodial ways with shelter and food, those kinds of provisions, but also they were communicated with, they were interacted with as people who belonged within the community. We'll get back to this and how it has in some ways regressed within religious communities. But let's move on. For me, it isn't just the pictures, although sometimes the way things are arranged visually is very telling. It's also the language that's so powerful. People often say sarcastically, oh, you're trying to be politically correct. No, I'm trying to be human correct. Let me read and share some of the 20th century language in how people have been described or referenced. In comic books, the little moron comic books, circa 1940s. These books of jokes use humor at the expense of the little moron. The word moron is unfortunately still used today by many people as a form of criticism. Once a medical term, moron, was used to describe people with an IQ of 50 to 69. It was used as such for the 1950s. Today, people with the IQ level are described by the American Psychiatric Association as having mild mental retardation. The sad part of it is, as illustrated by the educator Robert Gardner in the 1980s, is that there's multiple intelligences. The IQ tests have been revealed as predominantly verbal and reasoning emphasized, but there are many other kinds of intelligence, whether it's spatial, kinesthetic, mathematical, and musical. There's multiple intelligences, and because someone scores in the low range with regard to verbal skills, even though I have a sizable vocabulary, that isn't the total of intelligence quotient or measures. But that's what was often gauged in popular culture. And so people were called morons and freaks because of their appearance. You'll see and find in this museum references about ugly laws. If your limbs weren't proportionate to what was expected, maybe one arm was shorter than the other, as a dear family member of mine has, then you were expected to remain out of sight. If you in some way had a facial features that were disfigured, then you might succumb to what were known as the ugly laws. And quite literally, you could be arrested or fined for appearing in public because you were considered to be below public standards in terms of what an appearance should be, through no fault of your own. You were helpless that you looked or sounded or acted in certain ways that were not conforming to what people expected. There were rules and laws that kept people, and thus we had people, not just for reasons of shame, though that too, kept by their families in attics. This museum appropriately began in a garage. Like our first recording was in my basement of my house, even though the subject matter seems unrelated. It was about a family member who had ALS. People with disabilities were cordoned off in out of the way places because of appearance, because they didn't contribute in ways that people expected. And one measure of intelligence was also considered to be, could you hold a job? We're now finding in 2019 that people can hold jobs with adaptation. That's the social aspect. The medical aspect says we can do anything in terms of technology, and they have. They've made great strides in terms of prosthetic limbs for veterans returning from war. Other kinds of things over on the other side of the museum, there is the first walking device created and invented by an Israeli inventor, in which a full body kind of device for somebody who previously is unable to be mobile. And on and on and on. I mean, we have organ replacement and so forth. Medical science with regard to disabilities always, or has up until now, far outdistanced the social. That is, people have lagged far behind. Society's been less willing to receive people with disabilities in relationships. I mentioned earlier churches. In my experience, churches are great about installing handrails and ramps now that everybody else is. Why, that's the thing to do. Well, do you want to sit by somebody in the pew with autism? Well, now, no, churches are all set to put things in large print, to make hearing devices available, maybe even bring in an interpreter to sign, but not necessarily go to lunch with the person that has aphasia. And I sound a little sensitive on the subject, but I'm right. The social aspect of disabilities is the one that lags behind. The medical model for disability, we're all about making things, but I learned 2 decades ago, I took a course in organizational communication, and a fellow by the name of Jim Collins wrote a couple of books. One of them was Good to Great, about organizations and companies that want to make it to the top. And he made a very emphatic statement in his book: if you want to achieve excellence in your business, don't rely on technology. Technology won't save you. You got to achieve your mission. There's a lot of devices that have been created and invented for people with disabilities, and we're thankful they have. But at the end of the day, that's not the heart and soul of people with disabilities being empowered and being who they really want to be as just real people. Known not for their disability, but for their contributions. So you'll see and hear things that, like, well, in pop culture, we have the Wizard of Oz and the Munchkins, the little people, who are, you say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, there's nothing, but as it says in this poster, midgets or dwarfs today, called little people, were often associated with fairy tales or viewed by the public as a form of entertainment rather than real people with real lives, real dreams and hopes. All people want to be. Another article I read recently, I don't want to be inspirational. I literally had a lady who said, what's wrong with that? People with disabilities want to be more than an object put on a pedestal. They want to be people who have real ups and downs, just like you and me, dreams, failures, but known as people. Of course, they were restricted in employment and usefulness, going back again to time of the Middle Ages, as court jesters and fools. And even in the 20th century, we used language like, that looked upon people as, with disabilities, as to be pitied, looked down upon, maybe benevolently. What's wrong with looking tenderly with pity and sadness? It makes people less than people. Give so that Richie and all retarded children can be helped when I grow up. And we see people with elf-like ears and features. Just pop culture often showed people with disabilities in less than human ways. Whether it was in their physical appearances or the way they were photographed and so forth and so on. One over this way is, we all knew very well, Jerry Lewis and his famous Labor Day telethons for muscular dystrophy. Wonderful cause, very very difficult in terms of suffering. But critics have often said that Mr. Lewis would appear, he would come on in dramatic fashion and hold a child in a very benevolent kind of way, making him the hero and the savior of the disabled people. Well, why couldn't the people with the disabilities be their own heroes? And why couldn't they be looked up to as already courageous rather than needing someone with courage to come along and rescue them? Pop culture isn't always guilty. We've had a lot of good things taking place in recent times in the media, television, movies and theater in which people with disabilities have been main characters. But there's also been this kind of language and these kinds of depictions in which folks with disability are the helpless ones that need to be rescued, rather than people who could be contributors to society and have their own gifts to give. Ethel Smalls was the oldest daughter of a Methodist minister, born in that part of New York which gave life to the Seventh-day Adventist. And she married early in life at only 18 years of age to an abusive man who drank heavily. She gave birth to 2 children who both died very early, not long after birth. And Ethel Smalls was divorced at age 22. She continued on to try and manage a life. She sang in the choir and played the piano, but experienced some of the kinds of experiences that veterans returning from war would have, except in those days, women weren't supposed to have post-traumatic stress disorder from having troubled marriages to people who abused them physically and who were alcoholics. Only veterans were supposed to have that kind of trauma. So she began to suffer some of the kinds of problems that people under stress have, and within a short amount of time, Ethel, who was supporting herself as a seamstress and was admitted to Willard State Hospital with beautiful embroidery in her suitcase, just eloquent patterns. In 1930, she was admitted. Her file states that she refused to leave the place where she was living. The landlady where she had lived for 2 months said that she heard her talking to herself, and she started cussing and yelling, and the landlady evicted her, and she refused to leave. So she was taken to the authorities, and the judge had her committed to Willard State Hospital, where again, she lived out her life. Beginning from 1930, I suppose Ethel would have been 41 years of age until she died in 1973, 33 years later, all because of short amount of time of less than perfect behavior, but hardly something that was criminal. She did experience hearing voices or talking to whomever. As I said, she was born in that part of New York and grew up where that kind of spirituality was commonplace. The whole Seventh-day Adventist movement was one, if you'll recall American history, in which revelations occurred, and it was expected that Jesus was going to return on a precise date in 1844 because people had apparitions and visions, and Miss Smalls claimed to do the same. The book also depicts a rare experience of sexuality in which A charge nurse came by one evening, and Miss Smalls was in bed with another woman from there on the ward, and they were laughing and giggling, and the charge nurse asked what was going on, to which one of the ladies said, well, you're welcome to join us if you want to. And the next thing you know, the two women were separated in the hospital and never had contact with one another again. But it gives us a bit of a snippet or a quick view of how same-sex kinds of activity was treated in those days, in those types of facilities. It was not accepted, although men who might be inclined towards homosexuality, the term that was used for them, they were said to be masturbating. So some unique takes and perspectives on same-sex activity in the earlier part of the 20th century, especially within mental institutions. Miss Smalls, again, she died in 1973, was rare in the sense that she was not buried at Willard, but her family had continued to maintain contact, and when the time came, was buried along with other family near her hometown.